In this clip, we are going to have a look at issue 2, solely issue 2 of Merchant Bank, which is the equity financing question. Issue 1 is an off-balance sheet issue, which we will ignore for the moment. In looking at the information you've been given, we have Datatec, which is a company listed in the IT sector of the JSE, and they own 100% of the ordinary shares in Infodata. And they would like to list Infodata on the JSE and immediately on listing obtain 20 million rands worth of financing through an equity issue, but please note, 5 million through a placement of shares with a local institutional investor in South Africa, Old Mutual PLC, with the remaining 15 million being raised through a public offering. And so just be careful to check whether the issue through the placement of shares is going to result in Old Mutual being a public shareholder or not for listing requirement purposes on the JSE. Now, the statement of financial position indicates a few important things for us. So let's look at them. Firstly, there are 8.5 million shares in issue. That does not meet the 25 million required in terms of the listing requirements, and as such, we would consider here doing a share split to take it to as close to 25 million as we can. The own shareholders' equity amounts to 53.6 million. This, however, is adjusted for an NCI of 1.62 million. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, that in terms of the JSE listing requirements, the NCI is to be excluded. And so we would focus on the 53.6 million in testing the listing requirements, and then going down to the asset section of the statement of financial position, you will see there that there are intangible assets. Firstly, goodwill. We will look at note 1 in a moment, where the goodwill is valued at 8.86 million and other intangible assets valued at 2.13 million. Now let's have a look at note 1. The bought goodwill has not been valued in the last 12 months. And as such, the JSE listing requirements would require us to remove the goodwill from the statement of financial position for listing purposes. The other intangibles have been valued and given a reasonable value, and we assume here that they are being valued at that value for the application to list. Now, very important is the information given in paragraph 2. You are given an earnings per share based on the existing issued shares. And so please remember that to get the most recent year's earnings, I have to here multiply by the shares in issue, the 8.5 million, and not by the share split number or the number of shares in issue after the public offering. Now, very important is the information given just below that, and that is we expect that the existing operations earnings will grow by 20% in the forthcoming year, and that the dividends after 20x7 will grow at 10% per annum. That detail therefore tells me or implies that we are going to value D1 here. Should we need to value the shares for the listing, the existing dividend policy will apply, and so using the existing earnings per share of R1.36 and the dividend per share of 54.4 cents, you can calculate a dividend cover or alternatively dividend payout ratio. Just below that, we will consider then listing the shares at a discount of 20%, and if we're doing an offer to subscribe, that would give us a minimum value then that we would apply to setting a price for such an offer to subscribe, and then Datatec, because it is listed, it has a beta, but Infodata's beta is expected to be a beta of 130% of that of Datatec, allowing us to use the capital asset pricing model here, and we are given a yield on government bonds on the RSA 153 of 8.8, and that represents, ladies and gentlemen, in this question, the risk-free rate of return. Now let's have a look at the required. Right, we need to determine a scheme for listing at the end of the 20x6 financial year. We are going to use a dividend growth model to then determine a value for the listing. Right, so let's go and have a look at the suggested solution. Now in issue 2, you will remember that we only have 8.5 million shares in issue. We do not meet the 25 million required shares in issue, and hence will always, where possible, consider a share split before applying for a listing. And so to take these shares to as close to 25 million as we can would require us to split each share into 3 shares. Secondly, do we meet the equity required of 50 million? And the answer here is, depending on what line item you start with, if we take the total shareholders' equity of 55.24 million, we need to then remove the NCI. You could have alternatively started off with the equity value of the own shareholders, in other words, the holding company's shareholders, which would then be that 53 odd million I referred to earlier. You then wouldn't need to remove the NCI because it is not yet included in the figure that you've used. Less the goodwill here of 8.86 million that is not supported by a valuation within the last 6 months results in an equity value of 44.76 million, and that is less than the 50 million required. So the JSE's listing committee would need to determine here whether in their discretion, knowing that the company wants to do a public offering, would allow it then to not only in that process meet the 20% public shareholding required, which does not exist yet, as you will see in a moment, as well as simultaneously achieving the 50 million required equity value. Right, so moving down here, do they meet the required public shareholding of 20%? And the answer to that currently is no. Why not? They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Datatec. And so because of that, they would have to sell off at least 20% of the shares in data that they own in Infodata, or they would need to issue so many shares here to the public that the resulting public shareholding would be 20% of the total shares in issue after the public offering. Right. The pre-tax profit here, converting the after-tax profit to a pre-tax profit, is 16.055 million, which exceeds the 15 million pre-tax required. And so, getting then to the share issue price or valuation, from the information you've been given, we will have to here value the dividends a year from now, as you are required to use Gordon. If this investment that is going to be invested into is typically PPE, there is no return yet, and so it would be more valid to value the earnings or the dividends of the forthcoming year and not the most recent year. And so to do this valuation, we are firstly going to determine the existing earnings from the existing operations. Remember, calculating the total earnings using the shares in issue of 8.5 million. We will bring in 1 year's growth at 20%, and in doing that, we are taking the earnings to 1 year into the future. The earnings from the new investment will be 20%, 25% pre-tax return on the new investment. The total value of the new investment is 20 million, and so 25% return on that converted to an after-tax figure then says that the earnings, and I apologize for the incorrect reference just below that, the earnings, not the subscribed share capital, but earnings, 1 year after listing is 17.472 million, and using the expected dividend payout ratio based on the current payout ratio, which is 40%, yields a dividend then D1, which already incorporates growth of 6.988 million. The beta, as mentioned earlier, needs to be adjusted for the information given that it will represent a beta of 130% of the beta of Datatec, and that gives us a beta of 1.372 rounded off, and we substitute that into the CAPM, and we value those shares then before the discount at 95.4 million and after the discount of 76.38 million, which would be the minimum value then. We know that the value created through the IPO, which is 15 million, the placement, which is 5 million, yields a value of 56.38 million. Where does the value per share come from of R2.21? I can divide the 56.38 million by the 25.5 million shares in issue after the share split, which who owns? Datatec. Remember, Datatec owns all of the shares in issue. Right, and so through an offer to subscribe combined with an offer to a placement to Old Mutual at R2.21, so the 5 million placement divided by R2.21 gives me 2.262 million shares, which will represent, ladies and gentlemen, 6.5% of the shares in issue after the placement and IPO. They will be considered public for that reason. It's less than 10%. The public shareholders, we expect each of the members of the public taking up shares here to own less than 10%, and so the 15 million rand divided by R2.21 gives me a 6.787 million shares, and that represents 19.7 million shares. And a very important point, the last point there, as Datatec will not have to sell any of its shares, those shares would not have to be offered to its own shareholders. But remember, from the listing requirements, if a company wishes to list a subsidiary of itself and is going to have to sell shares to allow the listing to take place, they, being Datatec here, would have to have offered the shares it wishes selling to its own shareholders first, who may then waive the offer, and only then would the public be offered the shares.